So that was sort of a negative start, wasn't it? Everything is meaningless. But this is going to be a fun time. We're going to go and cover the Book of Ecclesiastes, the whole thing in 20 minutes, so buckle up. But first, a quiz. All right, so who wrote it? That's easy. When did he write it? Long time ago. 950 BC, people guess. What does that funny name mean? Who said that? Yeah, Ecclesiasticus comes from ecclesia, Greek word, which means the person that speaks in the assembly, or the preacher, the teacher. And the first opening line, he tells that that's who he is, the preacher, the teacher. And then the last thing, what kind of book is it? It's someone said poetry, sort of. It's a wisdom book. So just for fun, I want to go over different kinds of books. You can see there. Quick lesson on the side. 7 kinds of literature in the Bible, and you need to interpret them the way they're written. They're not all the same. So you should read poetry one way, and it's a lot different than law. You should read symbolism like that in Revelation, a lot different than you read the literal stories that are historical books. The letters to the apostles, the letters that the apostles wrote, you take those differently than the advice from the wisdom books. And if you don't read the Bible that way, you can be confused and maybe easily fooled. And that's how cults get started. So, anyway. Anybody know or remember that Ecclesiastes was also a top 10 song? It was actually number 1 back in 1965. You remember this song? It's all it is Ecclesiastes chapter 3, the whole song. It's pretty cool that it made it to number 1. Anyway, so a little bit of fun before we dive into the book. Have you ever noticed that the moment you finally get what you've been wanting, you immediately start wanting an upgrade? Think about it. Like if you bought a cell phone, 2 weeks later they introduce a new one, and you say, man, I wish I had that one. Or the car that you always wanted, you finally go out and splurge and get it, and then a nicer one drives by. You buy a new house, and immediately you start thinking about, how am I going to fix this up and make it nicer? Always pursuing, never quite being satisfied. It's almost like there's something inside of us that whispers, if I just had a little more, then I'd be happy. The craziness of this kind of thinking is sort of the core of Ecclesiastes. To understand Ecclesiastes, I think it helps to know a little bit about Solomon. And so here's Mark's paraphrased version of his story. When Solomon first took over from his father, King David, and he became king, God said to Solomon, hey kid, to help you get started, I'll grant you one miracle. What'll it be? And Solomon thought for a second, and he said, grant me wisdom. Grant me wisdom and knowledge that I may lead these people. So God replied, hey, great choice. Most people would ask for riches or a long life or kill off my enemies. Stuff like that. But since you didn't, I'll give you wisdom, just like you asked. And I'll also give you riches and honor more than anybody has ever had. So Solomon started off with a great start. He had money, he had power, he had smarts. But it seems like it wasn't enough for him. He wanted more. So Ecclesiastes, it documents Solomon's pursuit of more. His grand experiment to see if more was better. He tries 4 different things, 4 different pursuits to try to find happiness, purpose in life, meaning. And so this morning we're going to go on that little journey to see what these 4 experiments were and what did Solomon learn from them. And as we go down that path, I want you to think about your own life. Have you ever tried any of these? And how did that turn out? All right. The first one. If I only knew more, the pursuit of intellect. Here's what Solomon said. He said, I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. I thought to myself, look, I've grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone who's ever ruled over Jerusalem before me. I've experienced much of wisdom, knowledge, and then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom. And so people came from all over the world to hear him speak and hear his wisdom. And he became obsessed with being brilliant. He studied, he analyzed, he observed human behavior. He got 3 PhDs. If he had a podcast, he'd be number one. He became the smartest person in the room. I'm thinking, so do people fall into that kind of a trap today? Think about it. Are there people that just never stop taking college classes because knowledge is their thing and how they get their self-esteem? Or maybe a little more insidious, are those that are obsessed with the news, spending hours and hours watching and reading and thinking about, what's going on in the city and in the state and in the country and in the world. Always wanting to be in the know. I'm the one that's in the know. Or maybe it's keeping up with culture or fads or the latest ideas. It just never ends. So what was Solomon's conclusion about this quest for wisdom? He says, for with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Yeah. Here's a true story. So a journalist interviewed this Nobel Prize-winning scientist. He was a brilliant man, widely respected. At the end of the interview, the journalist asked him, after all your discoveries, which one gives you the greatest meaning in life? And the scientist, he sort of paused for a second, and he said quietly, that's one question science can't answer. Meaning in life. Knowledge is powerful, education's good, thinking deeply, that's a gift from God. But information doesn't fill the void that many feel in their hearts or in their souls. You can Google symptoms. You can research retirement strategies. You can win a Jeopardy, right? But Google has never once comforted someone at a funeral. Intellect can explain a lot of things. It just can't give you meaning or purpose. And sometimes, as Solomon astutely says, obsessing over knowledge can bring sorrow and grief. Solomon ends his first experiment with this realization. He says, I saw that wisdom's better than folly, obviously, just as light's better than darkness. But then I thought in my heart, what do I gain by being wise? For the wise man, like the fool, will not be long remembered. Like the fool, the wise man too must die. I got Einstein's picture there. Did you know Einstein was still working on his equations for the unified field theory while he was in his hospital deathbed? On the very day he died, he was still scribbling out notes. No matter how smart we are, we're only here for a few seconds, and then poof, we're gone. Jesus' brother James, he wrote this. He says, what's your life? You're a mist. Appears for a little while, and then poof, it vanishes. So Solomon realized that, and he concluded, if I know more, still not enough. Okay, experiment number 2. But what if I just feel more? And so he pursued pleasure. Here's what he wrote. He said, I thought in my heart, come now, I'll test you with pleasure to find out what's good. I want to see what was worthwhile for men to do under the heavens during these few days of our lives. I denied myself nothing in my eye desire. I refused my heart no pleasure. Solomon gave himself permission to enjoy everything. And he certainly had the resources to do so, right? As the world's richest man. Sounds like fun, right? But wait, there's more. He tries comedy. He tries alcohol. He tries entertainment. He tries romance. These things, they haven't changed in 3,000 years, have they? Solomon's not a man who just sampled these things a little bit. This is a man who maxed it out because he could. Did you know that Solomon had, he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. So he had 1,000 women. If anyone could test whether romance and pleasure would satisfy the human heart, it was Solomon. And what was his conclusion after all of that? He said it's like chasing after the wind. There's a story of a famous actor who once said in an interview, he said, I wish everyone could get rich and famous like I am and have everything that they ever dreamed of so that they would know that it's not the answer. And that was Solomon. He reached the top of the pleasure mountain and he found out that the view doesn't last all that long. You ever notice a post-vacation letdown? You plan the trip, you take the pictures, you eat the food, you lay on the beach, and then you come home. And then by Wednesday, you're thinking to yourself, is that all there was? Or the Thanksgiving meal, right? Days of decorating and shopping and cooking, and then an hour of eating, and then hours of indigestion, and days of dieting. It doesn't last. Pleasure's not wrong. God wants us to enjoy life. He even says so in the Bible a bunch of times. But the thing is, pleasure's sort of like cotton candy, right? It's sweet, it's colorful, but it dissolves really quickly in your mouth, right? It's gone in seconds. It looks like a lot, but it's not much there. Fun and pleasure, they're temporary. I like this quote. Someone said that pleasure defines the moment, but joy defines the person. Joy is built on a godly foundation. Pleasure is merely a temporary experience. So you might be thinking, good thing I didn't ever fell into that pleasure trap. Well, I hope not, but sort of a matter of degree. Have you ever thought about you've fallen into the trap of video games, hobbies, golf, TV, social media, cell phones, news, health, good looks? I don't have to worry about that one. We can get hooked and become obsessed with any one of these things and more. And they could become like a drug, always searching after that. A little bit more, a little bit more. Or they become worse, like a god. And when mixed with sin, the pursuit of pleasure can bring some long-term sadness. Here's a great quote from the famous preacher R.C. Sproul. He said, "No sin has ever made any person happy. Sin simply cannot bring happiness, but it can deliver pleasure. And when we confuse pleasure with happiness, we're wide open to the seduction of the enemy," right? The devil. So here's what Solomon says at the end. But that also proved to be meaningless, all these things he tried. Laughter, he said, it's foolish. What does a pleasure accomplish? And so Solomon's favorite word in Ecclesiastes is meaningless. Chasing pleasure does not give life meaning. And Solomon realizes that. And he just realizes that if I just try to feel more, it's not enough. All right. His third experiment. Well, what if I accomplish more? What if I try to accomplish more? Here's what he said. He said, I undertook great projects. I built houses, I planted vineyards, I made great gardens and parks, and planted all kinds of fruit trees. I made reservoirs. That was to water the trees. I owned more herds and flocks than anyone. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. He builds, he expands, he accumulates. He's the greatest of all time, to quote Muhammad Ali. What did he get? Solomon says, yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, everything was meaningless. Just chasing after the wind. There's a story about a businessman who he worked his entire life to build a successful company. Endless 60-hour weeks. He missed vacations. He sacrificed time with his family. Finally, he sold the company, made millions. A success. After the sale, they threw a big celebration dinner, and someone at the dinner asked him, hey, was it worth it? And he thought for a moment, he says, I'm not sure what it was all for. Achievement can give satisfaction, but it doesn't give meaning. We might not have the resources that Solomon had. You know, we don't have all the money and the stuff that he had. But we can still get caught up in this achievement pursuit, can't we? You know, for some of us, it might always striving for the next promotion. Or maybe it's just notoriety. I'm going to have the best lawn in the neighborhood, right? Or the best landscaping. Or I'm going to send my kids to the best school imaginable. I'm going to be the best in sports. I'm going to travel to the coolest places and then talk about it. Or maybe it's just prestige and power. Do you ever wonder why there's so many senators and congressmen that are in their 80s and 90s and still working? You know, having a nice lawn, being great at basketball, that's fine. As long as it's not your source of self-worth, right? As long as it doesn't become your God. You can reach the summit here on earth and yet still wonder, is that all there is? So Solomon comes to the same understanding again. If I try to achieve more, still not enough. Solomon goes on to his next experiment and final one, the pursuit of wealth, money, right? What's he say? He said, I amassed silver and gold for myself, the treasure of kings and provinces. He was the richest man of his day. Some might say he was the richest of all time. There's an urban legend about a reporter asking John D. Rockefeller, the richest man of his time and the world's first billionaire, how much money do you need? How much is enough? Rockefeller answered, just a little bit more. Just a little bit more. It's not greed talking, that's human nature. You know, money can improve your standard of living, but it cannot define your meaning in life. Money can buy comfort, but it can't buy contentment. It could certainly buy a lot of fun and pleasure, as we talked about. And I think that's why people chase money so much. They think that, you know, getting the fun and the pleasure will produce joy. But it doesn't. Here's what Solomon learned. He said, whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. And this, too, is meaningless. Notice he doesn't say money's evil. He just says it's insatiable. It can become insatiable. You guys want to win the lottery? Who wants to win the lottery? It always crosses my mind. Here's a story. 1967, a Texas man named Billy Bob Harrell. That's a good Texas name, right? Billy Bob Harrell, he won a $31 million Texas lottery. And at first, he did what many people say they would do. He bought houses and cars for his family and friends. That was nice of him. He gave generously to his church. Good Christian. He tried to help everyone who asked. But that was the problem. Everyone asked. People he barely knew began showing up and asking for money, and relationships became strained, and his marriage fell apart. And then within 2 years, his life collapsed, both financially and emotionally. And then sadly, shortly before taking his own life, he told his financial advisor this. He says, winning the lottery was the worst thing that ever happened to me. The worst thing that ever happened to me. And that story is repeated so many times. But yet, millions of people around the world play the lottery with the hope of striking it rich. Just a little bit more. Jesus said this on the Sermon on the Mount. He says, don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal. Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust can't destroy and where thieves can't break in and steal, because where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So in his final experiment, Solomon comes to understand, if I earn more, it's still not enough. Solomon uses the word meaningless a lot of times, 38 times in this short little book. And the Hebrew word for meaningless means vapor or mist. Just there for a little while, it's gone. Solomon isn't saying that life is meaningless. He's making the point that the things we pursue to give our life meaning, things like pleasure and achievement and wealth and intellect, they're just temporary. And they evaporate quickly. It's sort of like chasing after the wind. Solomon looks at that and says, if everything ends, how can these temporary things carry eternal weight? And here's his brilliant insight. He says, the problem isn't that life is meaningless. The problem is that we try to squeeze eternal meaning into these temporary things. And God designed those things to have eternal significance. Here's something very interesting that Solomon said. He said, God, has set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they can't fathom what God has done. I think everyone, Christian and atheist alike, they have a gut feeling that we're all eternal beings, We can feel eternity in our heart, as Solomon says. And as Christians, we fulfill that by pursuing God. But for the non-believer, they don't have that luxury. And so they try to fill that hole of eternity by pursuing these other things. And a lot of them are good. They'll throw their life into helping the poor and saving animals and social causes and protecting the environment. All good things. But they're missing the godly thing. The pursuit of God. After 11 chapters of Solomon's grand experiment pursuing the meaning of life, and each one of those experiments ending with meaningless, meaningless, everything's meaningless, Solomon finally gives us a solution for our eternal problem at the end of his little book. He says, not only was the teacher wise, talking about himself, but also he imparted knowledge to the people. He pondered and searched out and set in order many proverbs. And of course, Solomon is the author of the Book of Proverbs as well, at least a lot of it. The teacher, that's Solomon, searched to find just the right words, and what he wrote was upright and true. It's like Solomon had to brag a little bit first about himself before he gets to the conclusion. And here's the conclusion. Now all has been heard. And here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God, keep his commands. That's the whole duty of man. Solomon doesn't say, hey, you just got to try a little harder. He's saying you got to recenter your life. Meaning's not found by expanding life horizontally, getting more knowledge and more pleasure, more success. Solomon says meaning's found by orienting your life vertically, looking towards God. And when we do so, when we're focused on pleasing God, then we find true meaning. Our lives are not meaningless. Ecclesiastes shows us the emptiness of life under the sun, as Solomon calls it. The cool thing is the New Testament shows us someone who stepped under the sun, Jesus. Jesus lived fully. He worked honestly, he enjoyed meals, he had friends, he wept at gravesides, he faced death, and then he rose above it all. And when you are in Christ, work matters, joy deepens, ordinary life becomes sacred. Death is not the end. And when your life is centered on God, you might have less stuff, but you receive what you really want: joy and peace and meaning and purpose. I think God designed us to give our all to him. As Jesus said, to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. But if you don't believe in God, then that yearning imprints onto something else. And we try to give our all to some worldly endeavor to fill that void, to find meaning, to find purpose. Solomon had everything, and he said it's not enough. And the gospel whispers something better. You can have Christ, and he's enough. So maybe the question isn't how do I get more? Maybe it's, am I pursuing the right thing? Because if you build your life on more, you're always going to need more. If you build your life on God, you may not have everything here on earth, but you will have eternal things, and that's what matters. Well, I hope listening to this sermon wasn't meaningless.